The wind, a razor across the high plains, carries the scent of dust and distant rain. Jedediah Stone stills his hand on the fence post he's mending, his gaze drawn to the shimmer of movement on the horizon. It's not a rider, not a deer. It's a figure, stumbling, a swatch of blue calico against the endless brown. As it draws closer, the stumble becomes a stagger, the figure a woman, her dress torn, one side of her face a ruin of purple and blue. She collapses not 50 yards from his property line, a heap of exhaustion and pain. He moves without thinking, his long-legged stride eating the distance. He kneels, the scent of fear and blood sharp in the air. Her eyes, the one not swollen shut, flutter open, wide with terror. She tries to scramble back, a wounded animal. He holds up a hand, calloused and steady. Easy now, her breath comes in ragged sobs. He sees the fresh split in her lip, the older, yellowing bruise on her jaw. This wasn't the work of a long journey. This was the work of a man's fist. A cold, hard fury settles in his gut. He doesn't know who she is or where she came from, but he knows the kind of man who does this. And he knows she won't be going back. He scoops her up, her body shockingly light, and turns toward the sanctuary of his lonely cabin. As her head lolls against his shoulder, he speaks the words into the wind, a vow as hard as the land itself. You're mine now. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Jedediah carried her across the threshold of the cabin as if she were made of brittle glass. The single room was a testament to his solitary life. A stone hearth dominating one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a cot in the other. It was a space stripped of all but necessity, clean and ordered. He laid her gently on his own bed, the rope springs groaning a complaint under the sudden, slight weight. A soft cry, sharp with pain, escaped her lips as her battered body settled into the mattress. He didn't speak. Words felt clumsy and useless in the face of such raw suffering. He moved to the dry sink, the iron handle of the water pump squeaking a rhythmic protest as he filled a basin. He brought it back, along with a clean rag from a sparse stack on a shelf. He sat on the edge of the bed, the wood frame creaking. Her one good eye, a startlingly clear blue, tracked his every move, wide with a fear so profound it felt like a physical presence in the small room. She was a cornered rabbit, ready to bolt at the first sign of aggression. He dipped the rag in the cool water and wrung it out. His hands, thick with calluses from years of wrestling with wire, stone, and stubborn livestock, were surprisingly gentle as he began to clean the dirt and dried blood from her face. He worked with a slow, deliberate care, his touch feather-light on the bruised and broken skin. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the cloth and her shallow, hitching breaths. As he cleaned the grime from her neck, the collar of her torn dress shifted. He saw it clearly then, the faint, angry red outline of a handprint, the fingers pressed cruelly into her throat. The cold fury in his gut, which had settled there on the plains, hardened into a granite resolve. This was not a matter for debate or discussion. It was a fact, solid as the unforgiving earth under his boots. When he finished, he stood and pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin, tucking it in around her shoulders. "Sleep," he commanded, his voice rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by disuse and a sudden, unfamiliar swell of emotion. He turned his back on her then, giving her the privacy of his disregard, and crossed to the cold hearth. He knelt and began to build a fire, his focus absolute on the small, mundane task. The scrape of flint on steel, the careful placement of kindling, the eventual, hungry lick of flame. It was a ritual that anchored him, a familiar rhythm in a day that had suddenly and irrevocably broken from its course. She slept for a day and a half, a deep, exhaustive sleep that was closer to surrender than rest. Jedediah moved through his chores with a new, quiet weight to his steps. The familiar solitude of his ranch now felt different, punctuated by the silent presence in his bed. He mended the fence where he'd left off, his movements automatic. He fed the chickens and milked his lone cow, his mind circling back to the woman in the cabin. He ate his meals of beans and cured bacon standing by the stove, his gaze drifting repeatedly to the still form under the quilt. He was a man accustomed to the vast, silent conversation of the land, but this new silence, the one inside his own home, was dense and watchful. On the second morning, the smell of brewing coffee thick in the air, he found her sitting up. Her legs were swung over the side of the bed, her bare feet pale against the dark wood floor. She clutched the quilt in her lap like a shield. The swelling on her face had begun to recede, leaving behind a ghastly, mottled tapestry of purple, blue, and sickly yellow. Her eyes, both open now, were the color of a washed-out prairie sky after a storm, full of a weary caution. "My name is Eliza," she said. Her voice was a reedy whisper, raw from disuse and bruised by fear, yet it cut through the morning quiet with a startling clarity. He gave a short, curt nod, pouring chicory-laced coffee into a tin mug. Jedediah Stone. He crossed the room and handed her the mug. Her fingers, scraped and trembling, brushed against his as she took it. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a strange current of warmth and fragility. She took a sip, the steam warming her face. I was meant for Silas Croft." The name hung in the air between them, acrid as smoke. Jedediah's jaw tightened. Croft's ranch bordered his to the east, a sprawling property bought with old money and run with a casual cruelty. Croft was a man known for his quick temper and his heavy hand with his livestock. Jedediah had seen him whip a horse for stumbling. It was no great leap to imagine what he would do to a woman. "You ain't going to him," Jedediah stated. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a declaration of fact, as unchangeable as the sunrise. Her eyes, which had been so guarded, suddenly filled with a fresh wave of tears. But these were different from the tears of pain he'd seen before. These seemed born of a desperate, fragile relief. "He paid my passage," she whispered, the words a rote recitation of debt. "From Boston. The agency." "Consider it paid," Jedediah cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned away from the raw emotion in her face and stared out the small, square window at the vast, empty expanse of his land. It was a hard land, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. "You're here now," he said, his back still to her. "You'll work for your keep. You cook, you clean, you mend. You'll earn your place. But you ain't his. And you ain't mine like that. Neither," he paused, searching for the right words that didn't come easily to him. "You're just safe. Understand." Eliza looked from his broad, unyielding back to the sturdy walls of the cabin, to the fire that crackled in the hearth, a beacon of warmth against the chill of the morning. For the first time in months, since she'd made the desperate decision to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, the world didn't feel like it was poised to swallow her whole. The ground felt solid beneath her. She took another sip of the strong, bitter coffee. It tasted like survival. She nodded, a single, jerky motion that made the muscles in her neck ache. "I understand." The first days were a careful, silent dance of two strangers confined in a small space. Eliza moved about the cabin with a ghostly quietness, as if trying to take up as little room as possible. She found the sack of flour and the tin of lard and made biscuits, her movements hesitant in the unfamiliar kitchen. They were lumpy and a little tough, but Jedediah ate 3 of them without comment, mopping up the last of his bacon grease. The unspoken approval was more comforting than a string of pretty words would have been. He relinquished the cabin to her during the day, taking his work outside from sunup to sundown. He gave her purpose. "Them shirts," he'd grunted one morning, gesturing to a small pile of worn-out flannel on a chair. "Buttons are gone. Seams are split." When he came in that evening, weary and smelling of dirt and sweat, he found the shirts neatly folded on his cot. The buttons, scavenged from a garment in her own small, battered valise, had been sewn on with tiny, even stitches. The split seams were mended with a nearly invisible pattern. He ran a thumb over the neat handiwork. He had expected helplessness, a city girl unsuited to the rigors of this life. He was discovering a quiet competence instead. She, in turn, began to learn the rhythms of his life. She saw the way he moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard labor and deep-seated weariness. She saw the lines of worry etched around his eyes when he stared out at the sky, willing it to rain. She saw the profound loneliness in the way he sat at the table in the evenings, staring into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. The ranch was his entire world, and it was a world he inhabited alone. The crushing loneliness of the landscape, which had at first terrified her, began to feel different when shared. It was still vast and isolating, but it was no longer just her against it. It was them. A week after her arrival, the flour sack was nearly empty and the salt crock was low. Jedediah couldn't put it off any longer. A trip to Prairie Ridge was necessary. "We're going to town," he announced at breakfast. A flicker of the old terror returned to Eliza's eyes. "I can stay here." "No," he said, his tone final. "You're coming with me." He wouldn't say it aloud, but the thought of leaving her here, a vulnerable target should Croft come snooping, was unthinkable. She was his responsibility now. The thought was both a burden and a strange comfort. The ride in the wagon was mostly silent. Eliza sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands clenched in the lap of her mended calico dress. She had used some of Jedediah's wife's old things, found packed away in a trunk, to patch it. It felt strange to wear a dead woman's clothes. Jedediah had said little about her, only that her name was Martha and that the fever had taken her 3 winters ago. The cabin was his, but her ghost still lingered in the faded curtains and the small, chipped teapot on the shelf. Prairie Ridge wasn't much more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. But to Eliza, it felt like a coliseum. The moment they pulled up in front of Henderson's mercantile, the looks began. 2 women in bonnets, gossiping on the boardwalk, fell silent, their eyes fixing on Eliza's still bruised face. Men loafing outside the saloon stopped their whittling to stare. Every glance felt like a physical blow, stripping her bare, judging her. Jedediah seemed oblivious, or perhaps he was just immune. He swung down from the wagon and tied the reins, his movements unhurried. He helped her down, his hand firm on her elbow, a simple gesture of possession that was also, she realized, a gesture of protection. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, coffee beans, and dried apples. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with thinning hair and shrewd eyes, leaned on the counter. "Jedediah," he said, his gaze sliding past him to assess Eliza from head to toe. "Been a while." "Henderson," Jedediah acknowledged, his voice flat. "Need flour, salt, coffee. See you found yourself some." "Help," Henderson said, a sly, knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Heard Silas Croft was expecting a delivery. Seems it got misdirected." The air in the store went still. Eliza felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the floorboards. Jedediah didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his tall frame filling the space, and stared at the storekeeper. It was a long, cold, silent stare, devoid of expression but heavy with intent. It was the kind of look a man gives a coyote that's getting too close to the henhouse. Under the weight of that gaze, Henderson's smirk faltered. A blotchy red flush spread across his cheeks. He cleared his throat and looked away, suddenly busy rearranging a display of tinned peaches. "That'll be 2 sacks of flour, you said?" Henderson asked, his voice suddenly brisk and businesslike. "And the salt? And the coffee?" Jedediah repeated, his voice unchanged. The transaction was completed in a tense silence. On the ride back to the ranch, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, the silence in the wagon felt different. It was no longer the awkward silence of strangers. It was the companionable quiet of allies. He had defended her, not with fists or loud words, but with his unyielding presence. It was a small thing, a quiet act of defiance, but it was more than anyone had ever done for her. She risked a glance at his profile, stark against the setting sun. His jaw was set, his eyes on the road ahead. In that moment, she felt a flicker of something new, something that wasn't fear or even gratitude. It was a fragile, tentative sprout of trust. The inevitable confrontation came 2 days later. Jedediah was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat against the vast silence of the plains. Eliza was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts, the clean scent of lye soap sharp on the wind. A rider appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the bright afternoon sky. Eliza's hands froze on a wet shirt. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that posture, the arrogant set of the shoulders. It was Silas Croft. Jedediah stopped his work, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He watched as Croft rode down the slope and into the yard, reining his fine black horse to a halt just a few feet away. "Stone," Croft sneered, his eyes flicking past Jedediah to where Eliza stood, frozen by the laundry line. He dismounted, his movements proprietary and confident. "I've come for my property." Jedediah didn't move. He remained by the woodpile, his presence as solid and immovable as the granite boulders that littered the landscape. "You heard wrong," he said, his voice dangerously low. "There's nothing of yours here. Don't play dumb with me." Croft spat, taking a step forward. "I have a contract. Paid her passage from Boston. She belongs to me." He looked directly at Eliza then, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Get your things, girl. You've had your little holiday." Eliza felt a wave of nausea. Her legs trembled. The instinct to obey, to cower, was a deeply ingrained reflex. But then she looked at Jedediah. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He was simply watching Croft, his calm a stark contrast to the other man's blustering rage. "She's a woman, Croft, not a parcel," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the air like cold steel. "She came here seeking refuge. She's getting it. Now get off my land." The air crackled with tension. Croft's face, already florid, darkened with fury. His hand twitched, dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. "You think you can just take what's mine? The law is on my side. The law don't give a man license to beat a woman half to death," Jedediah countered, his eyes narrowing. "She's not going with you. Not today. Not ever." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. The wind whipped a strand of Eliza's hair across her face. The only sounds were the flapping of the laundry and the snort of Croft's impatient horse. Finally, with a curse, Croft seemed to recognize the futility of the situation. Jedediah's hands were empty, but he stood like a mountain, and Croft was not a man to engage in a fight he wasn't certain he could win easily. "This ain't over, Stone," he hissed, his voice thick with malice. He swung himself back into the saddle. "You'll regret this. I'll have the sheriff out here. We'll see who the law sides with then." He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs in cruelly, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. When Jedediah came back inside the cabin, he found Eliza pressed into the far corner, her body trembling uncontrollably. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to comfort her with words he didn't have. He simply went to the hearth, picked up his sharpening stone and the axe, and sat down. The rhythmic, grating shing-shing-shing of stone on steel filled the quiet room. It was a steady, reassuring sound, a promise of preparedness, a sound that said, "I am here. I am ready." And slowly, Eliza's trembling began to subside. Weeks bled into a month. A fragile routine settled over the ranch, a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. Eliza's bruises faded, leaving behind only the ghost of a scar at the corner of her eye. She filled out, the gaunt hollows in her cheeks softening. The terror in her eyes was replaced by a watchful calm. She learned to read the sky, to anticipate the weather by the feel of the wind. She learned the names of the wildflowers that grew in stubborn clumps near the creek. The cabin started to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. She even brought a few of Martha's things out of the trunk, a set of floral-painted china plates, a lace doily for the table, small touches of grace in the Spartan room. Jedediah said nothing, but he used the plates and was careful not to spill coffee on the doily. The unspoken truce was shattered one night by a storm. Not a rainstorm, but a storm in Eliza's mind. A scream, thin and terrified, ripped through the sleeping cabin. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, the heavy rifle he kept by his cot in his hands, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He saw her in the flickering moonlight from the window, thrashing in her bed, tangled in the blankets, her hands batting at an unseen enemy. "No, please don't," she whimpered, the words choked with horror. He crossed the room in 2 strides, setting the rifle down. He knelt by her bed, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and steady. "Wake up. It's a dream. You're safe." He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. She jolted awake with a strangled gasp, her eyes wide and wild with a terror that was not for him, but from a place he couldn't see. It took a long moment for her to recognize him, for the solid, real shape of the cabin to replace the horror of her dream. And then she broke. The rigid control she had maintained for weeks crumbled into dust. She curled into a ball and sobbed, not the quiet, fearful weeping he had seen before, but deep, wrenching sounds of trauma being torn from the very root of her. Jedediah did not move. He did not speak. He simply knelt there, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, solid anchor in her storm. He waited. He had learned from the land that some things could not be rushed. You could not hurry the dawn, and you could not hurry the healing of a wounded soul. When the sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she spoke, her voice broken and raw. It was the wagon, she whispered into her knees. From the station. He was drinking. He kept telling me what a good price he got. Like I was a prize, so. She took a ragged breath and continued, the words spilling out in a halting, painful rush. She told him about the things he'd said, the leering way he looked at her, the way his hands would grab and pinch. And she told him about the first time he hit her. It had been over something trivial. She had spilled a little water from the canteen. His hand had cracked across her face, stunning her with its casual brutality. Just to teach you who's master, he had slurred. We'll have you broken and proper for we even get home. She had waited until he was drunk and snoring. Then she had slipped out of the wagon and run. She had run blindly into the night, with no direction, no hope, only the desperate need to get away. She had run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, until she had collapsed where he had found her. Hearing the story, stripped of all ambiguity, Jedediah felt something shift deep inside him. The abstract, principled fury he had felt at her injuries transformed into a white-hot, personal hatred for Silas Croft. His protective instinct was no longer about doing the right thing for a stranger. It was about protecting Eliza. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently squeezed her shoulder. The words came from a place deeper than thought. He will not touch you again, he said. And in the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the wind howling outside, it was the most sacred vow he had ever made. The next morning, a new, unspoken understanding existed between them. The final barrier of their strangeness had been dissolved by her confession and his quiet vow. When he went out to the barn, she followed him. I can help, she said, her voice still hoarse but firm. He looked at her, then at the milking stool and the pail. He nodded. He showed her how to soothe the cow, how to lean her head against its warm flank, the proper rhythm of pulling and squeezing. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she was a quick study. Soon, a thin stream of milk was pinging against the bottom of the pail. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the cow chewing its cud and the rhythmic hiss of milk into the bucket. It was a simple, domestic scene, yet it felt monumental. It was the first true act of partnership. The hammer fell a week later. Jedediah and Eliza were mending a section of fence on the southern edge of the property when they saw two riders approaching. One was Silas Croft. The other wore a tin star on his vest. Stay here, Jedediah said, his voice grim. He walked forward to meet them, his posture relaxed but ready. Stone, the sheriff, a weary-looking man named Ames, said by way of greeting. Croft here has filed a complaint. Says you're holding his property. She's not property, Sheriff, and you know it, Jedediah said calmly. I have a contract, Croft insisted, waving a piece of paper. Signed and sealed by the mail-order agency. She's mine legally. Sheriff Ames sighed, looking from the paper to Jedediah. Jed, the law can be a sticky thing. This paper says he paid her passage. In the eyes of the law, that creates a debt, an obligation. Ask him what he did to her, Jedediah said, his eyes boring into Croft. Lies, Croft scoffed. The girl is hysterical, probably simple-minded. She ran off in a panic. It was then that Eliza moved. She walked from behind the fence line, her head held high. She stopped beside Jedediah, her shoulder almost touching his. It's not a lie, Sheriff Ames, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying on the wind. She looked directly at the sheriff, forcing him to meet her gaze. Mr. Croft struck me, more than once. He told me he would break me in proper. I ran because I feared for my life. She turned her head slightly, showing him the faint, silvery scar near her eye. This is his mark. Do you think I did this to myself? The sheriff looked at the scar, then at Croft's face, which was mottled with rage, and then at Jedediah's stony expression. He was a man caught between a legal document and a moral certainty. It's her word against mine, Croft blustered. She's a lying. That's enough, Silas, the sheriff said, his voice tired. Jedediah put a hand on Eliza's arm, a small, possessive, protective gesture. He looked at the sheriff. She's not going anywhere. But if you need a legal paper to make it right in your book, then you'll have 1 inch. He turned and looked down at Eliza, his expression softening in a way she had never seen before. Eliza, he said, his voice low and earnest, for her ears only. This ain't how I planned it. This ain't much of a proposal. But I'm asking, will you marry me? Eliza stared up at him, her heart doing a slow, painful turn in her chest. She saw it all in his eyes, the loneliness, the integrity, the fierce, quiet protection. He wasn't offering her a cage, but a fortress. He was offering her a name, a home, a shield. He was offering her a partnership. Ames, Jedediah said, his voice ringing with authority, never taking his eyes off Eliza. You can stand as a witness. This woman is no longer indebted to Silas Croft. She is my intended wife. She is under my protection, legally, morally, and in every other way that matters. A slow smile touched Eliza's lips, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. Yes, she whispered to Jedediah. Then she looked at the sheriff, her voice stronger. Yes, I will. Croft looked from one to the other, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been outmaneuvered, his legal claim rendered meaningless by a more powerful one. He opened his mouth, then closed it, sputtering like a wet fuse. Sheriff Ames looked at the couple standing together, the tall, resolute rancher and the small, battered woman who now stood beside him with a spine of steel. He looked at Croft's apoplectic face. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. Well, he said, a note of finality in his voice. That settles that, I suppose. Congratulations, Jedediah. Ma'am. He nodded to them, then turned his horse. Come on, Silas. Let's go. Defeated and publicly humiliated, Silas Croft had no choice but to follow, casting one last look of pure hatred back at them before riding away. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, but the silence was filled with the weight of everything that had just happened. When they reached the yard, Jedediah helped her down from the wagon. They stood for a moment, the space between them humming with unspoken emotion. I meant it, Eliza, he said, his voice rough. About all of it. I know, she said softly. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, wrapped around hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. They walked into the cabin together, hand in hand. The setting sun streamed through the window, bathing the simple room in a warm, golden light. It landed on the floral-painted china plates, on the neatly mended shirts, on the 2 chairs at the table. It was no longer his cabin or her refuge. It was their home. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not the battered woman he had found, but the resilient, strong, and beautiful person she was. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the vow he had made in the wind that first day had been transformed. It was no longer a declaration of possession. It was a promise of devotion. He was hers, just as much as she was his. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.